Welcome to Saturdays at 7, Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. My name is Todd Ream. I have the privilege of serving as the publisher for Christian Scholars Review and as the host for Saturdays at 7. I also have the privilege of serving on the faculty and the administration at Indiana Wesleyan University. Our guest is Cherie Harder, president of the Trinity Forum. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Todd.
Even before you joined the Trinity Forum in 2008, you invested in efforts to cultivate meaningful conversations. To begin, in your estimation, what is the good in engaging in meaningful conversations for individuals, families, church communities, and local communities?
It's a great question, Todd. And I think anyone who is a student of the Bible knows that Jesus did his teaching largely through conversation. And Jesus was not alone. Plato's dialogues, we know from classical historical sources that so much of education, the instruction and discovery of what it means to be a good person, to live a good life, to understand ourselves, each other, as well as God, takes place in conversation. And so, a good conversation, it is a sort of exploration where you're learning more, not only about a subject, but usually about the person that you're talking with too. I mean, those are the best conversations, of course. So conversations are worthwhile because they teach us about ourselves, about our creator, and about our fellow creatures, as well as the created world around us.
Yeah. Thank you. In your estimation, what, if anything, have we lost in terms of the ability to engage in meaningful conversations?
Well, I hate to be pessimistic, but I do think there's a lot that we have lost. And, there's a variety of culprits for that. But, it's impossible to kind of answer your question without talking about social media. And that, the medium through which we communicate affects not only kind of what we talk about, but sort of how we talk, how we communicate at its most essential. That's not a new insight, of course. That's Marshall McLuhan, that's Neil Postman. There are many brilliant minds that have really explored that. But, different forms of communication media affect the way we think, as well as what we think about. So I think it was Neil Postman who gave the example of it's very difficult to do philosophy by smoke signals. Just the form precludes the content. And every communication medium has a bias. An oral culture sort of had a bias towards memorizing stories, having a very good memory. A print culture really rewards precision and coherence and logic. A visual culture, sort of like television, rewards the sensational, the flashy, the attention grabbing. And social media basically takes a visual culture, puts it on steroids, and adds new twists too. So what goes viral in social media, and by viral, basically being positively reinforced by attention, whether it's measured in clicks or likes or reposts or retweets or whatever it is generally that which is speedy, often snarky, sensationalized, and often aimed at one-upping, dominating, or putting down other people. That's usually the kind of content that will get the most attention, that will get the most positive reinforcement. Introspection, courtesy, restraint, reflection, eager interest in the other person, the elements which make for a great conversation in person are generally the same traits or elements that get no interest at all on social media. And so as social media has kind of taken over more of our interpersonal communication, it has cultivated, through its reinforcement, again, tweet, likes, reposts, retweets, whatever it is, a way of communicating that actually breaks down our ability to converse well with each other. A great conversation involves trust. It involves curiosity. It involves listening to the other person. It involves genuine desire to know what they think. And if your orientation towards the person that you're conversing with is to dominate them, humiliate them, put them down, look for something much more sensational, that conversation's not going to go well. But that's exactly the kind of approach that's rewarded on social media. So I do see that as being one of the big things that has really inhibited the practice of good communication. Related to that, distinct but very related, is the norms of partisan combat, which are reinforced and amplified by social media, are huge deterrents to a quality conversation. And then again, a quality conversation involves curiosity about the other person, kindness, a sense of charity, a sense of curiosity, a desire to understand, a desire to go further. Again, those are essentially anathema to partisan political combat, which usually seeks to dominate, to one up, to destroy the enemy. And, usually the methods are twisting what someone has said or picking out the worst or the silliest thing that they've said and essentially amplifying it. So all of the norms of partisan political combat, or so many of the norms of social media, really all are about undermining what it means to have a great in-person conversation.
Yeah. What practices, if any, can we introduce or can we amplify, reinvest in, which could potentially counteract these forces that are impacting the way we interact with each other today?
Sure. Well, happily, there are and many of them start literally just around the kitchen table. Um, you know, Modeling and making a habit of entering into regular conversations with those you love, essentially it habituates and it cultivates a love for conversation. We all so want to be listened to. And yet, so much of social media communication is not at all about listening to others. So when we actually make that habit at home, that's the kind of habit I think that helps form and grow a love for good conversation. But there's lots of other things we can do as well. And of course, so much of the learning that goes on in many universities, especially liberal arts universities or colleges, takes place in whether it's a Socratic setting or a small group setting where you're discussing the work together, which basically kind of calls for a different kind of engagement with the work as well as with your fellow students than would be called forth by just, say, a test, even an essay test. I think the work of small groups in churches is really important and does a great deal, I think, to kind of cultivate both a love for conversation, but also an understanding of here's what it can do. And I also think that one of the most culturally potent, or perhaps counterculturally potent, if modest and overlooked ways of kind of pushing back against a culture that no longer knows how to listen or talk to each other, is the reading group. And part of what I mean by that is, like, essentially kind of what's a reading group? A reading group is a small group of people who are gathered together in the context of community and the spirit of hospitality to pay sustained attention to a text and to hear what the other person thought. And that is so contra to part of our cultural, I think, dysfunctions of deep distraction, an inability to listen, a desire to one up, the inability to engage with either text or each other. And part of what a reading group is in many ways a small liturgy, an embodied practice that helps us cultivate both a love for reading and a love of good conversation.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful. It implicitly comes with the acknowledgement that there's something I can learn from the text, but there's something that I can learn more about the text by engaging it with others and hearing their voices. And that perhaps I may have something to offer them, but There's that twofold acknowledgement of what could be greater as a result
You know,
of investment.
absolutely. I mean, in some ways, a great reading group is, a bit of stone soup where
Mm.
everybody brings something that either they got out of the text or was something that they wrestled with the text.
Yeah.
And as a result, not only do you start forming bonds with those people, but you have a much richer, deeper understanding of the text itself. And so I think that's one of the marvels and the joys of a good reading group.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask you a couple of biographical details, if I may. You grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and then traveled to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where you earned a bachelor's in government from Harvard. And then you traveled as a Rotary Scholar to Australia, where from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, you earned a postgraduate diploma in literature. In your mind, what, if anything, do good government, the focus of your undergraduate study, and good stories, focus of your graduate study, what do they have in common?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question, Todd. I think one thing they have in common is an imagination for the good.
Hmm.
And part of what I mean by that is it's been said that the big questions of the humanities are essentially kind of what's a good person, what's the good life, and what is a just society. And all of those are questions that involve moral and spiritual imagination. I was a policy wonk. I'll say just parenthetically, there's a big difference between like a campaign person and a policy wonk. So when I worked for the different bosses I had on Capitol Hill and in the White House and in the National Endowment for the Humanities, and my job was much more on the policy side. And when you're a policy wonk, essentially what you're looking into is what works well. What are the ideas translated into the policy that leads to a more just and free and flourishing social and political order? And that necessarily involves whether or not people really articulate it as such, a conception for what the good life is in a communal sense as well as an individual sense. As I described that, there's probably, you're already thinking there's a lot of tie-in between that and what a
Hmm.
great story does,
Yeah.
because, great stories always deal or wrestle with the truths of the human condition, like again, what it means to be a good person, in difficult times, amidst temptations or confusion or chaos, or you know, what one does when the heart is essentially in conflict with itself. It wrestles with what are the consequences of moral or immoral decisions, and who do we become, and what does the good life look like? In combination with all these other people that we have bonds with, or with from whom we're estranged. So I do think there's a lot of connection there, in that a great story allows us to sort of imaginatively enter into many of the questions that one has to wrestle with in real life in the policy world.
Yeah. It gives greater depth of what's possible as a result of that engagement. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. No, that's great. Who inspired your interest in government? Perhaps from the youngest age, but also, teachers or authors, as you progressed.
Yeah. So I'll confess, I was one of those really annoying high school debaters. Which, that's not a real popular thing for a teenage girl to be, but I was also just incredibly blessed to have a high school speech and debate coach, which in some ways was almost like a second dad to me,
Hmm.
in that he really encouraged me, and he saw, I guess, either abilities or whatever that I didn't realize that I had. And he invested in me and helped, try to call them forth. And I'll always be really grateful for him. His name was Paul Black. He's now 89 years old. I actually got to visit him a couple of years ago in Texas. But I feel really, grateful to him. I also had, again in high school, a literature teacher who was really demanding and just really excellent
Mm.
and made stories come alive and kind of showed me like, oh, there's, any great story has generally a lot more going on than you get just quickly skimming it. So, like most people, I had adults who gave generously to me without necessarily a lot of expectation or of return, and I just feel really grateful for those teachers. So, to answer your question, I was an annoying high school debater, and so we often debated different policy ideas. And there was also a program called Girl State and Boy
Hmm.
State. I obviously was involved in Girl State, not Boy State, but that kind of helped fire the imagination as well. And so sort of did that and Girls Nation and came to DC for the first time, 16, and it all just seemed like so exciting. Very little happens in Los Alamos, New Mexico besides nuclear fission. And so to sort of suddenly see, you walk down the street and you see these people on television and they're working on things that are really important. It seemed really exciting. And so I was getting to kind of, as much as a 16-year-old or whatever can wrestle with those questions in high school debate, but all of that really, intrigued me, the
Yeah.
prospect to DC after graduating from college.
Yeah. Some of those people at the Department of Energy are probably worried about what's going on in Los Alamos, though.
They made me.
Ask you a question then as a follow-up, and not law school then, as what was next.
Yeah. No, it's a very perceptive question, Todd. And we didn't talk about this, but you just picked up on it. I thought quite seriously about going to law school. And so I actually took the LSAT and was thinking about where to apply, that sort of thing. But I had sort of decided, well, I was kind of going back and forth between trying to come to DC and work on Capitol Hill,
Mhm.
go to law school, or go into broadcast journalism. And I'd done my kind of senior honors thesis. I did like an organizational study of television news. Well, the way I kind of wound up in DC is, with broadcasting, I finally figured out at 21, like, oh, you don't get to start out as like a national news reporter at DC or New York. You start out as, a weather girl in Duluth or whatever it is. And then, 2 weeks in, they can decide you're not, you know, cute enough or blonde enough or perky enough or whatever it is. And then you're, insufficiently cute, broke ex weather girl in Duluth, and life is kind of rough. And so I decided that, well, I'll go to DC for just a year or two and
Mm.
then maybe apply to law school after. And so I came to DC and worked on Capitol Hill. And once I was here, decided, oh, this is much more interesting than law school would be.
Yeah.
So stuck around until going to Australia to study literature for a year.
And then came back to DC, is that
And
correct? And came back to DC. So in what ways then has DC become home to you?
yeah, at this point, DC, it does feel like home. It's
Yeah.
been, gosh, it's been a good 30 years or so.
Yeah.
So, have lived here longer than any place. And DC can be a polarizing place, but there's also really a lot to enjoy and love about it. It's a beautiful place. I think one of the things I really like actually is no building can be taller than the Capitol. So there's no skyscrapers looming over you. There's actually it's very kind of humane, I think, as well as beautiful architecture. And one of the nice things about kind of no one in DC being sort of from DC, everyone sort of moves here. There's an openness and an eagerness to meet other people that you don't always find in other places.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned it can be a polarizing place. In what ways, though, can also DC be a challenging place to live?
Oh yeah. Well, there's a lot of challenges to living in DC, and and I will say it's a different place in my estimation than it used to be. So I worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years. Worked for a number of people on Capitol Hill. In 2006, when I was working for Senator Bill Frist, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, and then went to the White House. But 2006 was the last time I worked on Capitol Hill. And, Capitol Hill is always an intense, extremely fast paced place. There's always egos, always clashes. But at the same time, there was also, I think, some agreement on things that needed to be done. There was a shared idea that it was good to basically reach agreements, whether it was about budgets or bills. I think increasingly there's a sense now where more politicians are essentially using their office as a platform to kind of elevate themselves while denouncing the other side, as opposed to, doing the hard work of legislating, which includes making the agreements that are necessary to, basically come to a resolution over whether it's the budget or different bills that need to be passed or addressing different crises. And so we're at a place where very big crises go unaddressed just because there's no political upside to sort of sticking your neck out and whether trying to address whether it's runaway spending or entitlements or immigration bill or whatever else that are actually big national problems.
You mentioned your investment on the Hill, your work in the White House, and that you've been part of the city now for 30 years and that it's changed. In what ways has your experience with the city, with your professional interests, but also social interactions and engagement, how has that changed? How has the fabric of the city and your engagement with it changed over the course of your life?
Well, I will say just that there has always been political combat, and DC is the arena for that. But there's a polarization that's present now that was not true, of even 12, 15 years ago.
Hmm.
I think one could basically even look at the debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney and sort of see just what a change in sensibility there has been. And so, working on Capitol Hill, I worked for very conservative members who were at times, nonetheless still able to reach agreements or, essentially forge very unlikely partnerships across the aisle in order to pass a bill or do something that they thought really needed to be done. One example of that, when I worked for Senator Sam Brownback, who was one of the most conservative members of the Senate, he actually forged a really interesting partnership at one point with Paul Wellstone, the late Paul
Hmm.
Wellstone, the most liberal members of
Yeah.
the Senate. And it was around like the Violence Against Women Act. He also did a lot of that in terms of helping to create an office, to basically track religious persecution and religious freedom worldwide. And so, there were areas where people who disagreed and perhaps disagreed really deeply and passionately about some things could find ways to work together on other things for the sake of the common good.
Hmm.
That's a lot harder to do. And so that basically has a cultural impact, not only just on the level of like, members of Congress themselves, but it's felt, I think, pretty keenly in terms of staff and the like. And I think that the polarization that has affected the entire country has certainly affected DC.
Yeah. Thank you. Ask you a little bit about what you've learned from your experience. Then you mentioned your work as policy advisor to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, your work as a policy director for Senator Sam Brownback. You also served as deputy policy director at Empower America, senior counselor to the chairman of the National Endowment of Humanities, Bruce Cole, special assistant to President George W. Bush, and director of policy and projects for First Lady Laura Bush, which, by the way, my wife Sarah says was the best job that you had, was that last job I just mentioned. So, very large fan of the former First Lady there, I'll say. What discernment process led you from one role to the next? When you sort of look back, what have you learned from that? And for individuals called to public service, what advice would you offer them in terms of discerning when to make a change and how and who to serve and where to serve?
Yeah. Todd, I wish I could tell you that there was this really well thought out discernment process and grid that I sort of imposed on all those decisions and wound up making the right ones. And it wasn't that sort of cut and dry. For a while, well, there were several jobs that I took that I never applied for. They just, the opportunity came
Mhm.
along. first and foremost, and I guess this would also kind of dovetail with just a piece of advice, do I admire and trust who I would be working?
Mm.
Admire, trust, and agree with them such that, the work that we would be doing is work that I would be excited about, and really want to throw myself in. And then after that, it's like, is this a role where I feel like I have something to offer, where, I'm excited about where we would be going together, that sort of thing. But, I will say that on Capitol Hill or, in government in general, it was so important to work for people, whose character I trusted. Um, and that there's always going to be difficult decisions to be made. And, it's, or just different things that come up, complex situations, especially in government all the time, people have to make, hard decisions, with insufficient information, under deadline, under pressure, opposition each way, no perfect outcomes. And, you essentially have to do the best you can without knowing kind of, how exactly this will all play out. That's particularly true, I think, in the conduct of foreign affairs. And so a lot of it really came down to, do you trust, the judgment and the character of the person that you are working for? And one of the things I actually noticed while working on Capitol Hill is, how often an office tended to take on the sensibility or character, or just kind of like, almost kind of the culture of the member.
Mm.
And it was kind of a lesson just in how much, leadership plays a role. So, like, you have 435 House offices, 100 Senate offices, and, that wasn't true for all of them, of course, but there's so many of them, like the way that the member of Congress acted definitely filtered down to the way that Senate acted. And so you asked for bits of advice. I guess one bit of advice I would give is to seek out bosses and mentors where you not only kind of admire their career, or their judgment or their intelligence, but you admire and trust their character too.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to shift our conversation now to ask you about your leadership of the Trinity Forum. The Trinity Forum, quote, works for the renewal of society by cultivating, curating, and disseminating the best in Christian thinking for the common good, and by helping leaders to think, work, and live wisely and well, end quote. How do you and your colleagues determine how to fulfill that mission via the publications you prepare and distribute?
Yeah, a great question. And again, there's no easy grid. This is, art more than science. So probably the three focus areas at Trinity Forum would be faith and public life, the arts and humanities, and then spiritual formation. And so part of what we try to do, in our Trinity Forum readings, where is we try to take the best of literature and letters and essentially tenderloin it a bit, make it more accessible to a broad and thinking audience. So, for example, we just published Pardoner's Tale from the Canterbury Tales with an
Yeah.
introduction by Karen Swallow Prior.
Yeah.
Now, the Pardoner's Tale, it's a great story, but it's one that, perhaps the average, or just, the thoughtful lay reader, may not have been exposed to. And it may be that they're unlikely to read through the entire thing, but they'll read kind of an excerpt, from one of the tales with the introduction. And that might help give them a sense of why the Canterbury Tales are so important, why they still have something to teach us today,
Yeah.
and may with their appetite to kind of like dive in. We've done that with other works like, Augustine's City of God. Now, City of God, it's pretty, it is dense prose, but, book 19, which is the one we publish, is, one of its most significant. And there essentially we take a shorter book and we unpack it, like,
Mm.
why is this so important? What is there for us to learn today from it?
Yeah.
And so we do that for a variety of both, classic and more contemporary literature, to essentially try to welcome the thoughtful lay audience into some of the best thinking that the world has to offer on the big questions of life. And we essentially think all the big questions are ultimately spiritual questions. So that's, with our readings, kind of what we do. We also do a variety of programs, whether they're in-person events or our online conversations, where we essentially have the pleasure of getting to interview or talk with different scholars and public intellectuals, whether it's about a recent book that's out that's significant, or about just big questions that fall into one of those buckets. So it's a wide variety
Mhm.
of topics and people that we've spoken to. This Friday, I'm talking with Paul Miller, who is a professor at Georgetown, as well as a former member of the CIA and the Army, and a member of the National Security Council staff under President Bush, who wrote "The Religion of American Greatness," which talks about what Christian nationalism is,
Yeah.
how it's different from Orthodox Christianity, how it's different from patriotism. It's a question that's kind of there's been a lot of confusion. So
Yeah.
we will talk about that this Friday. Later this month, I will be talking with Abram von Ingen from Washington University on his new book, The Word Made Fresh,
Hmm.
which looks at poetry and why poetry is so significant and so important, and the insights it can give us into better understanding the original, the ultimate poet who spoke the world into existence. And so then we basically take a lot of that content, also make it available in podcast form, which is perhaps unimaginatively called just Trinity Forum conversations. And so part of our hope with all of this is uh, basically taking some of the best of Christian thought from across the millennia, contemporary as well as classic, and inviting a broad, thoughtful lay audience to the table to benefit from it. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of brilliant people who are not necessarily going to be full time scholars, but who are interested, and so we see that as part of our mission and our joy.
Yeah. And I would say, as one who's benefited greatly from that programming that you've shared, I'm particularly grateful for it, and I'm thankful. So thank you for all that you do.
Uh,
What do you and your colleagues consider as evidence when a particular effort has served that mission well? And given those sensibilities, how, if at all, have you adjusted those efforts over the years in relation to your mission?
it's addressing the latter part of it first. Before the pandemic, all of our events had been in person, just
Mm.
because we're big believers in person interaction. We're embodied creatures, and I thought that was really important. Of course, that became impossible once the pandemic struck. So we pivoted to online conversations, and that's sort of one example about just how our efforts to pursue our mission have changed with different circumstances, yeah, and over time. And so we continue to have in-person events now that the pandemic has subsided, but we're also kind of keeping up the online conversations just because we were so delighted to see what the response was and how much interest there was. So we're now kind of in a hybrid model. In terms of kind of how we measure, of course, one of the big challenges I think for perhaps anyone in the education or formation business is how exactly do you measure formation? And I'll be really interested in like what you think about that, and that the way universities often do it seems a highly imperfect yardstick, in that they sort of will measure graduation rates or starting salaries or what have you, which doesn't exactly seem to be a great yardstick for personal transformation or formation. That is one of the challenges. So one of the things we often do after an online conversation is we send out a survey. Not everyone fills it out, but a good chunk do. And we do ask people, how did this affect your thinking? Or is there anything you're going to do differently as a result? So we gather a fair amount of, I guess you could call it anecdotal data, but uh, there's certainly a lot of that in the aggregated kind of the impact of it grows. And part of what we are hoping for is just to encourage that kind of reflection too. And
Yeah.
so the very exercise itself is, we're not just hearing stuff, we're now encouraging reflection on, oh, now that I've heard this, now that I'm engaged with it, what then does it mean for me, for my thinking, for my relationships, for the way that I live my life, my embodied practices? And so, frankly, what we really hope for is exactly that kind of thinking, which is hard to measure, but is the basis for all the rest of it. Our thinking, our relationships, and our habits, ultimately form who we are.
Yeah. Thank you. And I would speculate that for some, that reflection will come soon, and they may have an immediate, but for some, it may come in a moment that, occurs later or comes as a result of, I listened, or participated in this program and this one, and then the sort of the cumulative component that grows, by engagement in those conversations, then allows them to see the world in enhanced ways than they otherwise would.
Maybe at some point we can even have an off the record conversation about how you all measure your impact.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's
Yeah.
a question.
If I may, then, is there one program that you hosted, and you probably, understandably think of all of them as having their own unique significance and the contribution that the conversation partner offered as being significant? Is there one that stands out in your mind, one that you remember, one that people resonated with? And maybe it was the moment in which it occurred. Maybe it was what was said. But yeah, is there one that you're and
I don't know. There's just one. Yeah, there were several. Well, I should say, it's like, who's your favorite child or whatever.
right?
I do
I
enjoy,
realized the question was unfair from the very beginning. Yeah.
but I'll mention a few that I thought were special. One of them was a conversation we hosted between Jonathan Haidt and Andy Crouch,
Mhm.
to do with technology, and they had not met each other before. So
Oh,
it was the first time I think they had met each other even virtually. So the first time that they had really talked. And I think there was something special about that too. Just, Jonathan Haidt is very faith friendly, but, he's not a person of Christian faith. Andy Crouch obviously is. Jonathan has done incredible thinking, I think, just on the broad topic about how social media and our media habits are forming us, and in particular forming digital natives
mm,
who have never known another land, beyond our media landscape. Uh, so that was one I think that I would, if any of your viewers have never seen an online conversation before, that I would particularly recommend. Yeah, really enjoyed our recent online conversation with David Brooks around his book "How to Know a Person,"
mm, mhm.
which I think actually picks up on some of the things that we've just sort of talked about here. And he synthesizes an extraordinary amount of psychological, organizational, sociological research into, an immensely readable book, that in many ways is a book about loving your neighbor well, and the implications and consequences are. But there's also a number of not nearly as well known guests that we've hosted that just really enjoyed and appreciated. We hosted two online conversations, at least two. Well, we've hosted many on suffering. We've hosted two on dying.
Mm,
One with Lydia Dugdale, and another with and Lydia is a clinical physician who's also teaching at Columbia, and with Amy Lowe, who recently wrote the book The Great in Between, and who herself only in her late 40s has stage 4 colon cancer.
yeah.
So on one hand, it was like a grim subject, but I think a really beautiful conversation. And actually, kind of adding to that, Kate Bowler as well. Essentially conversations that are hard to have, but really important to have.
Yeah.
So would recommend those. I guess I'll throw one more in, which is our conversation with Arthur Brooks on his book From Strength to Strength,
Mhm.
which talks about the challenges of midlife. It may just be that seem particularly resonant to me, given my own situation, but that was also one that I felt was quite special.
I may have watched that particular conversation and read the book with great interest for the same reason. So exactly. Thank you very much. As our time begins to get short, I want to ask just a couple of questions about how your efforts have intersected with individuals who've committed their lives to the academic vocation, a lot of whom we try to serve through the conversations that we host here. And they form and have benefited greatly from your programming there. But when you consider possible participants who've committed their lives to the academic vocation, what qualities do you find most compelling? And in particular, what virtues, intellectual, moral, or theological virtues do you find most compelling that those guests, sort of resonate with or radiate in your interactions with them?
Part of what we look like just in terms of what we look for in terms of suggesting guests or, some of exactly what you would like is, do they have expertise on a topic that is compelling and of broad interest? Is there an accessibility there, in that there are many absolutely brilliant scholars who are the world's living expert on Julius Ethel Rosenberg. I think that's a quote from like some Meg Ryan movie. But, like they have a deep expertise on a very specific and particularized topic. And part of what we're looking for are scholars who have thought deeply on a topic that would be of interest to a thoughtful lay audience, and that they are able to communicate it in an accessible way. We probably all talked with scholars who are utterly brilliant and perhaps slightly incomprehensible to the even the thoughtful layperson. So, people who are good communicators of often very complex topics and can make it more accessible. And I think embedded within that strength is a certain virtue, one of, you call it intellectual hospitality,
Mhm.
which is essentially kind of making something dense and meaty and difficult more accessible, more digestible, more welcoming to to people who are quite bright, are quite thoughtful, but
Yeah.
may not be but are not scholars themselves. And a thinking through again of what does this mean? My particular area of scholarly expertise. Why does it matter? How should it impact one's life, the way one thinks or relates, who or how much one loves, how one loves God and neighbor. Like, what does it mean, for the broader world? So, we're looking for folks who have thought and written really incisively and insightfully on those subjects in a way that's compelling, accessible, and welcoming
Yeah.
to others beyond their discipline.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate the way you've framed that ability on their part as an exercise of hospitality, their drive and commitment to inviting others into a conversation that they have a mastery of, but doing it in such a way that doesn't reduce the complexity of the conversation, but creates space for others to enter into it, who may not have the time, spend the time, etc. Investing in ways that particular person. I think it's a very, very thoughtful way of saying that. A considerable amount of effort has been invested into documenting and lamenting the withdrawal of individuals committed to the academic vocation from service to the public. Oftentimes, we call them, say, public intellectuals, even. In what ways, if any, do you find that withdrawal to be true? And what do you think, given the people with whom you interact, can we do to reverse that trend?
When I worked at the National Endowment for the Humanities, my boss at the time, would joke that part of becoming a scholar was knowing more and more about less and less until you eventually knew everything about nothing. I think it's an old joke, but it sort of speaks to the
Still
specialization.
true and thus still
Oh,
funny.
You know,
Uh,
speaks to the specialization and the pressures to specialize, and not just specialize, but silo
yeah.
in so many universities. So one of the things that we actually do with our senior fellows, we have, a little more than 2 dozen senior fellows
Mhm.
representing all sorts of both scholarly disciplines, but also people who are public intellectuals and not scholars per se. As once a year we have a senior fellows meeting, and a big purpose of that meeting is to, essentially better connect them and network with them with each other for the purpose of encouraging interdisciplinary conversations and collaborations. I mean, it is really hard to do that when all of the pressures at your university or beyond are towards specialization, the siloization, and the like to essentially distinguish yourself by knowing a great amount about a very tiny thing, and then just kind of working that more and more. So we're trying to provide from outside the university opportunities for the kind of conversation and imagination about what does this work mean for the broader public? What does my discipline and my research, how does that basically connect to, how is it in conversation with someone from a different discipline? And we've seen really kind of fun things come out of that. So, for example, well, a couple of our senior fellows, one is James K.A. Smith, who's an Augustinian scholar at Kelvin. Another is a guy named Kurt Thompson, who is a clinical psychiatrist practicing in Arlington, Virginia. A third is Mako Fujimura, who's a visual artist. In one of Kurt Thompson's books, he actually draws, quite heavily on the work of both, Jamie, the Augustinian scholar, as well as the visual work of Mako Fujimura. To build his argument and his examples that appear in his book. And his book is, he's a brilliant writer, but his book is the richer for it. And so part of our hope is to kind of encourage more of that the Christian scholars are Christian scholars because the truth that they're pursuing, it's not just a tiny, kind of siloed thing. It's a truth that affects all of us, and there's a relational aspect to it. So part of our hope is to encourage that, and we're trying to do it in our small way, even through our senior fellows meeting and providing network collaborative opportunities.
Thank you. For our last question, if I may, I wanted to ask you if you could interview one public intellectual from the past who you never got a chance to interview, who would that person be?
Oh gosh, well, how far past am I allowed to go?
As far back as you'd like, but I only gave you one.
Like your dinner party or whatever.
Yeah.
It's a cliche to say, but of course it would be great fun to have C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton. But I think I might go with Augustine. I think he'd be fascinating. In that, I mean, the guy was obviously just off the charts brilliant, but there's also just a sense of like you don't know what exactly he would say, and there's something just almost kind of emotionally raw about him too. Like you just kind of get the sense that this guy, he's a colorful character. And so, it'd be kind of fun.
Thank you. Our guest has been Cherie Harder, president of the Trinity Forum. Thank you for sharing your insights and wisdom with us.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you for joining us for Saturdays at 7. Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. We invite you to join us again next week for Saturdays at 7.